Good morning. I'm Kimberly Charrington. On behalf of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, or NIDS, I want to warmly welcome you to today's Huessy seminar, and a special welcome to our featured guest today, Dr. Christine Leah, coming to you from Australia. During today's presentation, we encourage you to submit your questions in the chat or the Q&A at the top of the screen at any time, which we will address at the Q&A portion of this talk, and stick around to the end to get insights on some of our upcoming speakers, or go to our website at bankdeterrence.com on the events page to learn more and register you and your colleagues. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our host for today's seminar, Mr. Peter Huessy himself, President and Senior Director of Strategic Deterrence Studies at GeoStrategic Analysis and a Senior Fellow here at NIDS. Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kimberly. I appreciate it, and want to welcome Dr. Christine Leah, who is here, our speaker today. What we're trying to do with some of these events is to give an appreciation to our nuclear folks here in America. What do our allies think of either the Chinese or Russian or both nuclear buildup, and how do they look at nuclear deterrence in their part of the world? Christine has an extraordinary background. She is a fellow with the National Institute of Deterrence Studies, as I am. Her previous government experience was a visiting fellow at the Center for International Strategic Studies in Pakistan, the Chauncey Postdoctoral Associate in Grand Strategy at Yale University, the Stanton Nuclear Security Postdoctoral Fellow at MIT, a visiting fellow at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, a journalist at Karen News Thailand, a summer research associate at the RAND Corporation, and a research intern at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Singapore, and a research fellow at the Australian Strategy Policy Institute, and a research intern at the IISS in London. She will review the perspectives of Germany, France, United Kingdom, and NATO on China and its nuclear buildup, and following a brief exploration of European debates about China, she will outline the implications of China's nuclear buildup for European security. So with that, Christine, welcome to our seminar series. We are very happy to have you here from Australia. And so over to you.
G'day, Peter. G'day, everyone. And thank you so much, everyone, for having me. And I'm deeply honored to be a part of this series. Peter Huessy has been a great inspiration to me throughout my years as a student, a PhD student, and then a postdoc throughout many years. And I'm greatly honored to be here today. Thank you, Peter. I'm actually going to be talking about the Asia-Pacific dynamics of Asia-Pacific security and what it means for extended deterrence and U.S. extended nuclear deterrence in the region. So g'day, as we say in Australia. So the kind of introduction here is like the Cold War construct of thinking about U.S., of thinking about nuclear deterrence, and it kind of was a unique development in international history. In many ways, this construct of two nuclear-armed superpowers competing for global influence was the new dynamic of what international great power competition would now look like in modern history. But what appeared to be a global competition was actually in practice a much more regional focused one, focused on Western Europe and NATO. Because we in the Asia Pacific, sort of Australia specifically, and South Korea and Japan more generally, we weren't at the front line of it all. And we really got the leftovers of deterrence thinking and its application in terms of concepts, thinking about force readiness, force generation, and declaratory policy. We really kind of got the leftovers of all that. As I argued in one of my first books, Australian the Bomb, the credibility of END, extended nuclear deterrence, in the Asia Pacific from the late 1960s was to a large extent based on certain geopolitical circumstances that shaped what William Walker calls a nuclear order, where it was unlikely that any strategic attack on Australia, Japan, and even South Korea would occur outside the context of a more general global war between the US and the USSR. That order was characterized by a relatively stable distribution of power, a bipolar nuclear deterrence system, relatively limited nuclear proliferation, and the absence of immediate and specific threats to Australia. And then this order remained fairly stable for more than 30 years. However, we're now entering what I would argue a new nuclear disorder, both at the global level and a regional one in the Asia-Pacific. With China's belligerence in the South China Sea and the Asia-Pacific since the early 2010s, let's be honest, its increasingly bellicose rhetoric and activities against Taiwan and its rapidly expanding nuclear arsenal, we now have a trilateral nuclear superpower situation where the US needs to deter Russia from aggression in Europe and China in the Asia-Pacific at the same time. And how do we think about concepts of nuclear strategy in this, our region, the Asia-Pacific, this very different geographically and geopolitically, very different region to NATO and Western Europe? And I'd argue, and many would argue, Washington is going to have to work much harder to reassure its allies in the Asia-Pacific. Again, this vastly different theater to Western Europe in terms of geopolitics, geography, and political alliances. And as one of my professors, Paul Brecken, likes to say, it's easy to forget how much the Cold War was a European affair that spilled over to other regions, and how deeply Eurocentric nearly everything was about the first nuclear age. And there really hasn't been nearly as much thinking about scholarship about deterrence dynamics in the Asia-Pacific, in the Asia-Pacific as its own system in its own right, if that makes sense. So the concept of nuclear order, William Walker, he is the scholar on this. It's a system where not only the possession, but also the use of nuclear weapons is controlled. The number of nuclear weapon states is relatively small. Nuclear weapons are no longer considered as merely bigger and better conventional weapons, the way they were until the late 1960s. Also, there are no direct and immediate military threats to US allies in the Asia-Pacific. Also, major war between nuclear powers is considered relatively unlikely. And also, after the Second World War, at least for Australia, it wasn't until the late 1960s that the world managed to establish a relatively stable nuclear order. Again, the absence which pushed countries such as South Korea, Japan, and even Australia to explore having their own nuclear deterrent. So specifically for Australia and the period of nuclear disorder that ensued after the end of the Second World War, it's important and interesting to understand Australia's strategic culture, which is, again, strategic culture is its own discipline, but it's really interesting to understand Australia's strategic culture. Imagine throwing a bunch of 1788. Imagine throwing a bunch of convicts to the other side of the world, to this unknown continent, and establishing a quote-unquote white colony, and trying to establish sort of colonies in a similar but not the same way to the United States, sort of having states. So, for example, Washington State, Texas, and so forth, in a similar vein, but not exactly the same at all. We tried to establish states such as Queensland, New South Wales, Western Australia, and so forth. So initially, Australia, modern Australia as we know it today, was established and understood as a system of federated states, and so forth. And it was only until 1901 that Australia became a federation, and became a nation state, relatively independent from Great Britain in 1901. But still, it was, for the longest time, Australia, even when it became a federation in 1901, there was very much still this concept of empire defense, that Australia, as a colony of Great Britain, was a part of the Great British Empire. And so there was still this mentality of empire defense. And so that is one of the reasons why Australia sent a lot of troops to Western Europe to defend the empire in World War I and also in World War II. Again, this concept of empire defense. And that is also one of the reasons that Australia, after the Second World War, having been bombed by the Japanese in World War II, there was still this concept of empire defense. And, okay, well, although we are an emerging nation, we are still part of the empire, and we would still like to contribute to defending the empire. And the empire is wanting to develop nuclear deterrence as a concept, and so Australia will contribute to this. And so Australia contributed technology, scientists, and land to testing, developing nuclear weapons for the defense of the greater empire, right? But at the same time, some things happened. And so Australia was wanting to develop nuclear weapons, one, in parallel for the defense of the empire, two, for the defense of its own emerging concept of mainland defense, because again, the British at this same time were withdrawing its troops, famously the concept east of Suez, and east of sort of Singapore, where it had traditionally stationed troops and so forth. Australia was kind of grappling, Australia as a nation was kind of grappling with this concept of existing outside the context of its great and powerful friends. And so whilst it was dealing with the concept of existing outside the British Empire, it was also looking forward to, so who might we turn to next? Perhaps the United States. So there was this kind of this transition period. So long story short, it was a pretty turbulent time for Australia from the late 1940s to the early 1970s. Again, before World War II, the British Empire had been strong enough to dominate the Asia Pacific. And now the region was no longer being dominated by this great Western maritime power. The Asian powers themselves, primarily China and Indonesia, were beginning to shape the system themselves, a situation that Australia was unfamiliar with. In the late 1950s and 1960s, there were fears that there would be invasion from communist China and Indonesia. Again, the northern city of Darwin had been bombed by the Japanese in the Second World War. The Korean War was still going on. And again, the United Kingdom was withdrawing troops from Southeast Asia and focusing on the Soviet threat to Europe. And so during this time, so from the late, the kind of the mid to late 50s to early 70s, Australia didn't perceive that it had sufficient conventional forces to defend itself alone from any threat coming from the north. And so in this very unfamiliar situation, it sought security through nuclear weapons. And now, so part of the initial rationale for an Australian capability was for the country to be part of this responsible contributor to the defense of the British Empire. Again, I bring this up. Again, Australians still had this mentality of empire defense, and nuclear weapons were seen as a way to contributing to that. So initially, the British nuclear weapons program saw Australia playing a key role, not least the testing of both atomic weaponry in the Australian desert, but also their delivery systems like Bloodhound and its Blue Streak missiles. But without the British actually making any guarantees that Australia would receive its own sovereign nuclear deterrent. I see the questions coming up. I love these questions. We'll get to all these questions. They're awesome. I love them. Thank you, everyone. Just going through the history very quickly. I'll try and be very quick. Eventually, the British ceased cooperation under pressure from the United States, which wanted to control nuclear sharing under the McMahon Act. And at the same time, through the late 1960s, the UK was withdrawing more and more forces from Southeast Asia, making Australia feel even more vulnerable. And at the same time, the perception was that nuclear weapons were becoming merely bigger and better conventional weapons, like the latest thing in modern warfighting. And also at the same time, and going back to William Walker's concept of nuclear order and disorder, there weren't really norms around the possession or use of nuclear weapons, let alone an actual treaty against nuclear weapons proliferation. There were concerns that China's detonation in 1964 would spur other countries in the region to embark on their own programs. Indeed, soon afterwards, the Indonesian government under President Sukarno announced its ambitions to acquire nuclear weapons. And so at this stage, this is the mid-60s, the Australian government does two things. It turns to the US for security assurances under ANZUS that had been signed in 1951 that when, where, and under what circumstances would the United States use nuclear weapons in the defense of Australia's interests? In other words, extended deterrence. 2, the Australian government ramps up efforts to develop its own nuclear weapons capability independently of the United States or the UK. So in the vein of seeking assurances about extended nuclear deterrence, from the late 50s to the early 70s, senior officials from the Australian Atomic Energy Commission, the Department of External Affairs, which is today's DFAT, the Australian Department of Defense, repeatedly sought assurances from the US on the circumstances in which the US would use nuclear weapons in the defense of Australia and Australian troops operating alongside US forces in Vietnam. And US representatives from the US State Department were consistently evasive on the matter, vaguely stating that Australian forces should, contribute to the overall stability of Southeast Asia without discussing contingency planning or giving information on US military plans in the region. Discussion concerning Australia's need to know about aspects of US basing and planning policies continued back and forth over the span of several years to no avail. So given serious misgivings about America's willingness to assist its southern ally, senior officials in Canberra made it clear that Australia would not sign or ratify the NPT without formal guarantees of protection against strategic attacks by the PRC and Indonesia on Australia. Now, there's this fantastic quote. I like to bring it up because it's kind of cheeky, but it's in the National Australia Archives. This is a great quote by an Australian official, I think in Indonesia, talking about Dr. Subandrio, who is President Sukarno of Indonesia at the time, his formal foreign affairs advisor, saying, talking about Indonesian independence and the right of all nations to acquire nuclear weapons. So he says, this is an Australian official saying, quote, I am cabling in clear Subandrio's comments on the desirability of all nations possessing nuclear weapons. Under the pressure of local power politics, I fear the wily doctor has gone a little mad. ... The Italian ambassador today referred to Sukarno as El Duce Indonesia with a slight stink of the French. While this comment is a little naughty, it is rather close to home. End quote. I thought that was quite entertaining. But it's rather interesting because by the late 1960s, things started to change for Australia. The threat of major power conflict in Asia was receding, and intelligence assessments about Chinese and Indonesian military capabilities were becoming more accurate. Relations with both China and Indonesia were beginning to stabilize. The new government under Suharto didn't share the same nuclear nationalism as the previous dictatorship under President Sukarno. At the same time, there was kind of a growing norm against both the possession and the use of nuclear weapons, both regionally and internationally. More and more countries were ratifying the NPT, so the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and signaling their renunciation of their own nuclear weapons ambitions. And it's so interesting. Indeed, Australia was one of the last countries to ratify the NPT, believe it or not. And one of the reasons the Australian government at the time decided to do so was the fact that West Germany and Japan had done so. And what I gather from the archives is that if these states were happy to rely, quote unquote, on US extended nuclear deterrence, who are in far graver national security predicaments, then surely Australia could afford to outsource nuclear deterrence as well to its great and powerful ally, the United States. And so at the same time, we saw kind of the Cold War system of deterrence blocks, we might call them, between East and West, generated what international relations scholars might call a structural credibility for extended nuclear deterrence, where the US could not afford to abandon any of its Western allies without risking its global credibility as an ally committed to extended nuclear deterrence as a concept, and as a foundation for international security. And Australians Australia's region during that time was such that there were no substantial threats to Australia that would not also threaten US interests. So I call this the indivisibility of a nuclear alliance. So in that context, since the 90s, senior officials in Canberra have assessed that any nuclear attack on Australia would be unlikely to occur outside the context of a general nuclear war between the superpowers. And I've nearly finished here. And for the contemporary era, so now these forces I think what's really interesting now is this significant change in geopolitical context that at least historians have been seeing since the early 2010s, and at least since the late 1980s. A friend of mine who passed away recently, very sadly, Richard Bitzinger, he was at Nanyang Technological University. He was one of my bosses. He had been watching Chinese naval military modernization since the 1980s, saying, look, things are apace. But I think what's really interesting is seeing how quickly countries have, especially in the Asia Pacific, Japan, Australia, South Korea, have been reacting to what has been coming historically. But it's been real obvious to people such as us historians, looking at Chinese military modernization for the last few decades, is yes, this has been coming for some time. Why are we only reacting like the United States, Australia, Japan, South Korea? Why are we only reacting to it now? Quote unquote. And I think it's really interesting because countries, I presented a paper at a conference in Pakistan back in April about missile defense. And I think it's very interesting because most countries that have thought seriously about deterrence and extended deterrence have tended to be nuclear weapon states or direct and or immediate beneficiaries of U.S. extended nuclear deterrence, and have thus gone on the journey of thinking about fundamental deterrence concepts such as damage limitation, escalation dynamics, escalation control. What are the parameters of nuclear command and control? What does that look like? I'll stop shortly. I think it's really interesting that countries like Australia and Japan and South Korea, who have not been historically direct beneficiaries of US extended nuclear deterrence in the way that NATO has, that they are going on that journey, looking at it, deterrence from a mostly missile defense perspective. But missile defense is but one component of deterrence, and we need to have the punishment aspect. So how do we think about, going back to the purpose of this talk, how do we think about deterrence and the concepts of deterrence, like punishment, damage limitation, escalation control? How do we think about this in a maritime theater where the Allies are certainly working together, but not in a formal alliance like the NATO organization? I'll stop there, and thank you so much for putting up with me. And please throw me difficult questions. Fortunate.
Another question, Christine, comes up. What impact does the Pakistani-India rivalry and conflict play with respect to how Australia looks at the nuclear balance?
Peter, that's such a great question. Thank you. I remember talking about this again, Hugh, I see you're online. I see you. No, I remember asking my professor Hugh White this question because I was wondering about, like how does Australia think about its regional security, and to what extent, like, what countries does Australia think about? I mean, certainly we think about it in Indonesia, in the immediate sense, and certainly China in the immediate sense. But it's a great question. And I remember when I was an honors student, I was talking to different officials in the Australian government, like, oh, what about India and Pakistan? Like, oh, they went nuclear in 1998 and so forth. And I remember the broad response was, well, it's interesting in the sense of the regional balance of power, whatever that means. But it's not of direct relevance to Australia. It's relevant to Australia in the sense of the regional balance of power and geopolitics and China and Russia and so forth. But it's not an immediate issue for Australia, which I thought was really interesting.
Another question, Christine, is from Australia. I would assume there are a variety of views in Australia about this, but it's a debate we have here in America too. What are the strategic objectives of China? And to what extent is their buildup of nuclear weapons designed to let them achieve those objectives, without which they might not be able to do that? The most obvious thing is Taiwan. Okay. But my view is it's more broader than that, but I'll turn it back over to you is in terms of what you think the strategic objectives are of China and what role their nuclear buildup plays in this.
I'd love your broader view, Peter, please.
Pardon?
I would love your broader view.
Well, China is engaging in what they call unrestricted warfare. And they want to replace us as the world's hegemon, though I don't think we're the world's hegemon right now. But China, when you look at their rhetoric, I mean, it goes far as saying that they own the moon. And they want to put facilities on the moon which will enable them to control space, which is true. If you can attack the Earth from moon. So that's what I think their objective is. And I think Taiwan is one of a number of objectives, that just taking Taiwan doesn't fulfill their global hegemonic. In fact, I think they want to become a global hegemon and then take Taiwan. So they'll prevent us from coming to the defense of our allies, which is what their nuclear forces are for. Them to get us to stand down. And so I shouldn't go further because it's your show.
No, Peter, it's a conversation. No, I really respect and appreciate your views, and I think they're valid. I'd just answer from an Australian perspective, and I mean, I come at it from a historical perspective. I think you're right. That being said, I'm not sure that China yet has global ambitions. I'm sure it has regional ambitions, but that has global implications, right, for the United States. That's what I would say.
Okay. The next two questions are related. The first one is, what's the perspective in Australia of the concern the Republic of Korea has about the adequacy of extended deterrence, particularly nuclear extended deterrence? Every month you see an American visiting, and we shake hands and we have mutual talks, and we re-emphasize we really are dedicated to the defense of this, of the Republic of Korea. So my questions are two. One is, what's your view of, are the South Koreans worrying about something that they don't have to worry about, But number two is, what would happen if the Republic of, well, they want extended deterrence to be strengthened, but what do folks in Australia think of the Republic of, we're talking about getting their own nuclear deterrent or bringing an American deterrent onto the peninsula?
Yep. Those are terrific questions, Peter. Okay. No, they're genuinely really great questions. So for the first one, I suspect, I think, and I can't speak, I don't speak for any South Koreans at all. I have South Korean academic friends who are very interesting people. I'm not surprised, and I rather expect that South Korea expects more from the United States in terms of extended deterrence assurances, and quite frankly, everyone says that. Quite frankly, after the United States withdrew its forces from South Korea after the end of the Cold War, I was a bit surprised myself. But I'm not at all surprised or shocked by South Koreans asking for more U.S. extended nuclear deterrence guarantees from the United States, including deployed forces, including deployed bombers, the LRSO and so forth. That's entirely normal. I don't think that's taboo. Given, I mean, again, it's a very strange situation coming up off from the end of the Cold War, where nuclear weapons. Oh, it's taboo to talk about nuclear weapons and strategy. It's like, no, it's not. This is just geopolitics as usual. Okay. So I think that's healthy, and that's a healthy debate to be having in South Korea. I think it's a healthy debate to be having in Japan. I think it's a healthy debate to be having in Australia. However, again, my views represent my own views and nobody else's. I am personally a huge fan of US nuclear weapons being deployed in theater to demonstrate credibility, tripwire, etc., all the concepts you want. I think the US should be having more deployed forces in theater to demonstrate credibility, tripwires, escalation dynamics, escalation control, escalation dominance, and so forth. Unfortunately, that is not a popular view to have in Australia because of the taboo around nuclear weapons, and so forth. But again, I think this is a debate. This is a healthy debate. It's an unfortunate debate because no one wants to be in this situation. But if we're going to be serious about geopolitics, strategy, and deterring major power war, these are the debates that we need to be having. And by golly, we had them during the Cold War in Western Europe. By golly, is it not our turn now in the Asia Pacific to be having such debates?
Another question comes up that given the United States did not deter Russia from invading Ukraine in the first place, we're talking about 2014 and 2022, in your view, and from the perspective, let's say, of Australia, though they're probably quite a different number of views, but how does that affect your thinking with respect to, does China take from this that we will not come to the defense of Taiwan too much, but just a little, or some, but not enough to change the outcome? Because I don't see American forces going to Taiwan and having battlefield conflicts with the Chinese on the island. My view is we either get there and prevent the Chinese from taking over, or we're late to the party. And then we have to expel the Chinese, which is different horse of a different color. So one of the questions was, if you assume we didn't deter Russia from invading Ukraine, but we've deterred them from using nuclear weapons, what impact does that have with respect to the perspective Australia has on China's threat to Taiwan?
That's a really good question, Peter. I'm not sure how to frame my answer, but I will bring up the point, one of the points that one of my professors, Hugh White, who I think is on this call, he's brought up the point that, and I'll start off with this and I'll go into more detail. He brought up the great point, because I was asking him and one of my other professors, Paul Bracken, about, how does the US demonstrate its willingness to defend its Asian allies? And Paul Bracken was saying sort of, well, how do we demonstrate resolve and capabilities? And my professor, Hugh White, was saying, well, that's all well and good. Capabilities are one thing, but like, what are the actual US interests in the region? Like, is the US willing to fight a nuclear war on behalf of its allies? And like, the US can't just say, oh, well, our allies are interests. It's like, well, yeah, but allies are a means to an end. So what's your end?
I hear you.
But no, you raise a great point. And I would point out that I guess, unfortunately, it is a detail, but it's an important detail, is that Ukraine was not a part of NATO. It wasn't an ally, a formal ally. And it does raise the question of, to what extent are formal alliances important in this day and age, like written in treaty documents, as opposed to allies, like partners. But like, I guess in the Asia Pacific, we understand that, because we have a very different alliance system, right? Like, we're not NATO. We're not a land block that is very carefully delineated against the Soviet Union / Russia, right? Like, we've got the US over here, we've got the US-Japan alliance, the US-South Korea alliance, the US-Australia alliance. It's a hub and spokes system. We are not a multilateral alliance. We are separate alliance systems. And we do stuff together, but we're not formally an alliance. But it's an interesting dynamic because we're doing so much more together in the Asia Pacific, right? Like, we've got trilateral arrangements around missile defense, logistics, and so forth. But you raise a really great point, Peter. How do we see Ukraine? Well, I guess we try not, I think in the Asia Pacific, we try not to focus too much on Ukraine formally. I don't know if that makes sense, as in, like, we don't take too many lessons, because Ukraine was never a NATO member. And I guess we focus on the formal arrangements within formal alliances, as opposed to, oh, we may or may not do this, but like, so I guess, what's the takeaway? In the Asia Pacific, we're really keen and interested to work together, and we are working together, like on missile defense between Japan, Australia, the United States, and again on logistics. But I guess, and it's really interesting. I've been to, when I was in government, I was in a conference which is classified, but it was really interesting because I was in the Asia Pacific group, and compared to the NATO group, it was like, and us in the Asia Pacific group, we were like, oh, where's Great Britain? We need to talk to them about missile defense. And like, oh, they're in NATO meetings. Like, oh, okay, all right, all right. Well, we're just gonna get on with our stuff. Like, it was like, oh, they're doing their formal meetings, but like we're informal, so we're just gonna get on with doing our stuff. If that makes sense, I'm not sure.
We have a question from Steve Schenkel from the War College, the Navy War College. Quite interesting. He's got two questions and related. I'm going to read them to you. The Department of Defense's concept of integrated deterrence using all elements of power across all domains as well. What recommendations do you have for the U.S. to better integrate with its allies and partners from Australia's perspective? And what's interesting, he says, how would that be messaged to the PRC? And related to that is, what about if Australia had a dual capable aircraft, but the nuclear weapons part of it would be under U.S. control until possibility of being used, which we have done with other countries. And then again, how would that be? How should you present that to the PRC? So the first part is integrating better with our allies. The second part is whether you have a nuclear capability, which is on dual use aircraft, which bifurcates who has the aircraft, who has control, and so forth.
No, thank you, Peter, and thank you, sir, for that great question. On the first part, that's a great question, and I have to admit, I have been confused by US messaging on integrated deterrence. Maybe I'm old school, but I always understood deterrence as being, the threat of punishment, and so forth. So I've been quite confused by this concept of integrated deterrence. I mean, is it all aspects of national power and so forth?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's what it means. Is it use all elements of national power that are on the table, as opposed to, oh no, we're only going to use this, but not this and this. Like information warfare is part of diplomacy, it's economics, it's politics, and it's also military.
Yeah,
that's what it's meant to mean.
Thank you. No, thank you very much, Peter. Yes, yeah, that just so you know, that has been a confusing point for allies, and also in Australia, because Australia has been relearning what deterrence means, and integrated deterrence has just been even that more confusing. No, but thank you, Peter. It's a great question. Thank you, sir. My answer to that piece would be, I'm not sure, genuinely. And there is confusion in the allied space as to what integrated deterrence means, because deterrence as a concept for so long has been so well understood, and this new concept is just very confusing, and it's mixing soft power with hard power, and
very true.
It's not helping at all. This is not a political comment at all. No. It's just, please do not make the language more confusing for allies. Allies have enough time understanding, especially in the Asia Pacific, where we have not had to think about deterrence for such a long time. Please don't confuse it even more with language like integrated. Okay? Just like very simple, capability times will. Just keep it simple, please. Please.
That's going to be quite a task to go rewrite all the policy papers in the Department of State and the Department of Defense.
Well,
Steve's going to have one heck of a project if that's what they tell him to do. But I hear you. I think, Christine, your answer is quite interesting, that because it's considered fashionable to use the word integrated, it's also considered smart. It's also designed to say, well, we're not just going to bomb somebody, but we're going to use other instruments of power, and maybe that'll work.
Okay, Peter. Just
no, I hear
two,
you.
But also...
I hear your. We've got a few minutes left. We're at 10:55, but I hear you and understand what you're saying. I'm just laying you why the word was there. Some people who genuinely, hey, it really does mean something stronger, and we call it integrated because they work with each other, as opposed to, oh, it's a fancy word to make it look as if we're doing something that either we should have been doing anyway or already doing, but it really doesn't change anything. It's you can choose one or the other.
No, I take your point. It's just the Allies are having enough hard time understanding what deterrence is. Please don't use the word integrated.
Okay.
Please.
Okay. We're at 10:56. There are a couple other questions. One was, I don't think you can answer, but it was, how quickly could Australia get a nuclear bomb if they wanted one? Which I'm asked, that's what was in the chat. Okay. On the other hand, there's another question is, Australia had some reservations on the NPT, and then they dropped them. They went away in some years ago, but can you recall what they were, and was there any significance as to have those reservations being dropped?
Yep. So long story short, and I say this from a public open source view, Australia does not have, I don't think, has the means to develop an atomic bomb anytime soon. Regarding the NPT, what I know is from the late 60s to the early 70s, Australia was happy to sign the non-proliferation treaties back in 1968 under Prime Minister John Gorton, who was quite pro-nuclear bomb, on the condition that Australia had the lead time to develop nuclear weapons if necessary, which is why he did not ratify the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But then again, there was a change in politics, change in intelligence, change in economics, and then eventually there was a change in government, which was quite left-leaning, which said, no, we're just going to ratify the NPT. We're not getting nuclear weapons. We're not doing anything nuclear. It was a radical change. So that was 1973 under Gough Whitlam, Labour Prime Minister at the time. But long story short, for a long time, Australia's condition of signing and or ratifying the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was based on having a lead time to build an atomic bomb or some sort of atomic device that was detonable, and that's in the National Archives. So this concept of lead time was very important. Yeah, but eventually, the left-leaning, I'm not being political here, but like the left-leaning government at the time in 1974 ratified the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, saying Australia will not become a nuclear weapon state, etc., etc.
Well, thank you. We have come to the end of our time, and I want to thank Kimberly for all her wonderful logistic help and putting out the invitations and so forth. It's wonderful. Christine, thank you. That was eloquent and enjoyable, and we learned a lot. And we hope to, of course, have you back. And we also do a triad event every year, and hopefully maybe we could do someone when you're here in America, and you take part. It's down in Louisiana State University in Shreveport, next to Global Strike Command. I want to thank our sponsors and friends who are joining us today. I want to thank all of you for taking the time out of your busy day to come and hear a perspective that is very important. And again, Christine, on behalf of NIDS and our president, Jim Petrovsky, want to thank you, and thank you for joining us. You did a great job, and we look forward to talking with you again. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.